Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to those friends who are in America and good evening to our friends in China. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this workshop, Introduction to Games for Learning, organized by Penn China Education Summit 2022. My name is Yuqi Wang. I am one of the two Learning Technology Panel Directors for PCES this year. Today, we'll also have Mingjian Zhang here as our operation specialist. Both of us will be the moderators for the workshop today. For any comments and questions, please do feel free to leave them in our chat box. At the end of this workshop, we will have a Q&A session. Before we dive into the workshop today, please allow me to share our Future Education Summit schedule with you. This workshop is a subset of our Learning Technology panel. The main venue of Learning Technology panel will be held at 8:30 to 10:30 p.m. in Eastern Time on March 25th and 8:30 to 10:30 a.m. in Beijing Time on March 26th. Please do screen capture this page if you are willing to attend our Education Summit next week. We have 6 panels this year: Education Entrepreneurship, Education Technology, Education Equity, Diversity in Education, Early Childhood Education, and Vocational Education. This year, all the panels will be held online and each panel will last for 2 hours. So today, PCES Learning Technology panel is proud to present you with an introductory workshop on games for learning with Dr. Duval from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Duval has worked as a computer programmer, high school teacher, instructional designer, and writer. All of these experiences have informed his perspective on teaching, learning, and technology. His research interests include designing technology-enhanced learning experiences, game-based learning, computational thinking, teaching professional development, and corporate training. Without further ado, let's get this workshop started. So let's welcome Dr. Duval.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Yuqi, for the introduction and for inviting me to this workshop. I'm excited to be here and talk about one of my favorite things, which is video games, and how we can use those, especially for learning, obviously. So I'm going to try to share my screen. I think this will work. All right. Everybody can see that now? All right. So
yes.
I'm going to play this as a slideshow, so it might limit how much I can see of anything in the chat or anything like that. So just alert me if I start overriding anything that's going on. But yeah, so we're going to talk about video games for learning. And I said in my bio, it says this is one of my interests, one of my research interests, but I think about things a lot from a design perspective. So I consider myself to be a designer of learning experiences, especially with technology. And so I take that design perspective on how I approach different things in the world. And when I was a high school teacher, I was teaching business education classes for 12th graders. So, more advanced high school students, but it was an elective course. So we had some freedom to do some different things. And I found a video game that was essentially like a turn-based business game. So you had a product and you were trying to figure out how to sell it. So you had to calculate your costs, calculate what you would sell it for, and market it effectively. And this was the free module, right, of the game. And it said, it was pretty quick, I should say, to complete because it was the free tutorial module. But it was really a nicely designed game. And so I made a whole plan of instruction for 2 weeks that we'll get the full game and we'll, integrate that with what we're learning in our business, from our business, ideas. And when we bought the whole game, I took the plan to my department chair, had to make a case to him that we weren't just wasting time playing games, that we were actually going to be learning from this game, and that this game was very well designed to accomplish the learning goals for the class, and persuaded him to buy a full class license for the full game. And when I did that, we got the full game, and the rest of the game was nothing like the free tutorial module. The rest of the game was just multiple choice questions about business concepts. So quite a bit of a downer for me, because I had been planning this whole unit based on the concept of how the free example of the game was, and then we got the full game and it wasn't that, and I had to switch. Also, I had made this argument to my boss, who was a little leery about games, and now it's not a great game. So that was one of the reasons why I decided to pursue my PhD, because that problem, like, how can we make a game that works well for learning? Because games are so fun, people play them, people pay. James G, in his article that I've mentioned here, says people pay to play games and spend hours playing games, right? And they're paying to do that. And then we try to do this in education, and it sort of seems to fall flat. So, why are video games good for learning? That question is one we'll start with. And G argued that, of course, video games are fun and motivating, but what makes them good for learning are that they use certain design principles to encourage players to take on long, complicated, and difficult problems with the goal of succeeding in the game. And so, I have a citation for this article at the bottom here of the slide, but basically in this article, he describes three main areas where games have design elements that improve learning. So he talks about player empowerment. And an example of this is players co-designing as active agents how they're going to play the game. So allowing players to take multiple strategies towards winning. Customization of the gameplay and of the environment sometimes, and also at times taking on a new identity or trying out an identity in the game, or making your own identity for the game. The next category he talks about is problem solving. And so good games have problems that are well ordered, meaning they go from simple concepts that you do in practice until you get them to more complex issues. Pleasantly frustrating, so not too easy, but also not too hard, like just right, so that it's, you feel like you're stretching to get there, but you're going to get there. Sort of that Vygotskian zone of proximal development. And then information available to you just in time, so when you need it, and or on demand, so you can go find it when you want it. And then the third main area is understanding. So G talks about how good games develop system thinking and create meaning as action. So oftentimes when we approach learning in a school setting, we think, well, we have to give students the vocabulary, we have to train them in the underlying concepts, and then we can start to help them think about how everything fits together and connect all these things. But in games, you don't do any of that stuff first. You learn how to do it by playing the game. And so the game makes models and simulations that simplify things, and also can make important things stand out more than they would in a realistic setting or in the real world. So all these things make video games good for learning. Plus, as G mentioned, they're fun, right? So this is why he recommends video games as one approach to teaching and to learning. But there's this idea of commercial games, which we just talked about, like entertainment games versus educational video games. And there's a distinction between the two. And in this article, in the 2005 article, G only used commercial games as examples of good game design for learning. And he says at the end, often serious or educational video games that are designed explicitly for use in education aren't very well designed. The reason is, number one, it's hard to do. It's hard to say, I want somebody to learn for instance, these mathematical concepts, and then also create a game with a storyline that incorporates those into the gameplay in a natural way. Also, as I just mentioned in my example from my own experience, for teachers, you not only have to get the students on board, which most students would prefer a video game, even if they don't like video games, would prefer that to listening to the teacher talk. So it's usually easy to get the students on board, but you still have the administrators of the school, so the principals, department chairs, curriculum designers, and also the parents who may be leery when they hear, oh, we're playing video games in Mr. Duvall's class. And they might wonder, well, is this really what should be going on for my student when I'm trying to get them educated for the world? So oftentimes it's easier to make that argument if you have an educational video game. So a game that is explicitly designed and marketed as a serious game or a game for learning, right? But again, oftentimes then those games focus on the learning part of it and forget about the fun, motivational game playing part of it. So that's sometimes it's referred to, and you'll see in the literature, like chocolate covered broccoli. So it's the idea that, I can put as much chocolate as I want to on my kids' broccoli, but at the end of the day, it's still broccoli, and they're going to pick up on that pretty quick, right? So any video game, whether it's commercial or educational, should incorporate the things to be learned seamlessly into the gameplay itself. And the game should be fun to play. The article I've referenced at the bottom here is from one of my professors at Drexel, Dr. Foster, and his supervising professor was Dr. Mishra. But they talk in this article about how most people, even if they don't like video games, will acknowledge that you learn something from video games. The concern is people think you're not learning anything important, right? So our goal is to make games that help us learn important things, but also fun things. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that it's not 2005 anymore when G wrote his article. So we are starting to see at least some examples of good games. So I just wanted to mention a few good educational games, I should say. So I'm going to click on this. The Eco Move, I think, from Harvard. Now, this is actually a fuller project that now consists of multiple things. So they're branching into some like augmented reality and some other sort of tools that they're developing. But it started out with this Eco Move, which was a 3D virtual world. And you'll see it says, look and feel similar to video games. So this one may not be quite, it may be more of a gamification aspect than an actual video game. But basically in these environments, it's like an immersive world that you can explore, and you go around and conduct an investigation to try to determine why something is happening. So there's a pond in the town that's polluted, for example, and you have to understand and determine what's happening to it and then make a recommendation for fixing it. So that's one example. Crystal Island, Lost Investigation is also, and I mean, part of the reason why I picked these games is these tend to be the kind of games I like to play. There are other good examples of video games, educational video games that aren't, first person world explorer games. It just happens that I like those kinds. So those are the ones I tend to really pick up on. But this is a game where you are on an island where there's an outbreak of a virus. So also timely. I think they started developing it before the pandemic, but timely in terms of the pandemic and some science understanding that students could get. And basically you go and explore the island, interview people, collect objects, make a diary, and then at the end you sort of have to present what your diagnosis is, like what has happened on this island and how we're going to cure it. So again, it's inquiry based and it's a science game. The last one that I'm not going to talk about too much because I'm going to do a little playthrough of this later, is Prodigy. So Prodigy is a math game. They're also under development. They say they have an English game. I don't know when that one's supposed to come out, but English language. learning. So that will be interesting to see. And so this is a game where it reminds me of the old, like old RPGs, like the original role-playing games, where you would go, you walk into a village and you've got your party with you and you're trying to uncover stuff, and also have to do like battles along the way. And it's a similar game to that. So you're trying to basically find a pet that's going to work with you throughout the game, and then you have to challenge like angry creatures and use spells to calm them down. All right, so we'll look at this game in a minute. I think it's an interesting one. And the other interesting thing here is this game, and all the games actually, have a pretty elaborate setup of supporting materials. So in Prodigy, for example, there's a teacher dashboard. And as a parent, I can also, if I want my kids to play this at home, I can set up a parent dashboard where I can also see like what they're doing in the game. They've done a lot of research, obviously, about how this affects math test scores. So they're thinking about it, from that perspective, which is not a bad way to think about it. Maybe not the way I always think about it, but you can see that they've got a number of materials here and ways for different people to engage with it and to access like what's going on. I will say that, like, as the parent, so I checked out a little bit of the parent dashboard, that there's, you can get some basic reports for free, and then they charge you to get more advanced reports. So this is one way. The other challenge, I think, for educational video games is always, how do we make enough money to be a sustainable business? Because we can't just make video often, unless we have a grant or are independently wealthy, we can't just make video games for free. It's very resource intensive. But also, most people who do educational video games don't want to make millions of dollars. They're not trying to do that. They're just trying to make enough to sustain the business and continue developing the game. And so they want to make it affordable for schools and for educators. So how do you do that, right, is always a big question with video games, educational video games. All right, so the next question then, from my perspective as a teacher, especially, I think about this. So I think about video games as both a teacher and a researcher, right? So what do teachers need, especially K-12 teachers? And I did want to note, obviously, Dr. Kafai is here at University of Pennsylvania, and she's been, one of the reasons that I was excited to come to the university and work is because she has done a lot of work in games and knows so much that, I'm eager to continue learning from her. And now, I'm at a place where she's working, so we have, I have a better connection, a way to access that information from her than just, visiting at conferences and things where she's presenting. So she wrote an article back in 2006 about the difference between instructionist and constructionist. And so I just wanted to note that, because it is an important distinction. We're talking here about an instructionist standpoint, which is how do teachers teach students with video games? Constructionist viewpoint would say, how do we help students create video games, right? And that's an interesting thing, and something I'm also interested in. I worked on a project called Skyscraper Games, where we worked with middle schoolers in Philadelphia who made video games that they played on the Sierra Center by the train station in downtown Philly, using the building as the display. So, that was a ramped up constructionist project. However, that takes even more work, because now you have to train students, not just in the content of what you're trying to teach in your class, but also how to design a game, how to develop a game. So, not to say it shouldn't be done, but for this talk today, we're talking about instructionists. So teachers who just want to use games to teach as another tool or strategy for teaching in their classroom or activity. So what do teachers need to do that effectively, right? And just a few things. Obviously, you have to evaluate possible games, like decide which one or ones you're going to use. And then you have to plan instruction around it. So what are we going to do before we play the game? What do the students need to know that's not in the game itself? how am I going to act during the gameplay? How are the students going to act during the gameplay? Like, what are our roles going to be? And then after the gameplay, what should we do? How should we sort of make sure that students are understanding what we wanted them to get from the game, or build on it, or whatever it might be? So, there's a number of sort of approaches to how to do that from a teaching standpoint. I included one, again, from Dr. Foster, who I worked with at Drexel, but he had proposed a game network analysis. And actually part of that was this model called PCARD, which stands for play, curricular activity, reflection, and discussion. So basically, you have the students play the game, you do some curricular activity related to what they did, where they reflect on how it was for them personally, and then you have a discussion where they work in groups and maybe as a whole class, so that you can sort of assess and make explicit anything that you wanted them to learn from the game. And then, of course, if you're talking about teaching and school, there has to be some kind of assessment, right? So what are my assessment options if I'm going to have the students play the games? And many more things than this, right? So the question that I thought of from my teaching days is, how can we evaluate educational video games? Because for teachers, the most precious resource, of course, is always your time, because that is by default limited, right? None of us can make extra time, even though, like, here in the States, we try with the daylight savings, like, it's not extra time, we're just taking it from somewhere else, right? So you only have a certain amount of time to use. So I'm always thinking about these in my research interests, like, what can we sort of develop that will help us as researchers, but also help practitioners in some meaningful way in their practice. So I have a research team that includes Yuchi, and we've got 8 of us who are investigating this question or problem, and we're developing a model to analyze video games based on the user interface features. So sort of like, how does it look and feel when you play it? The design for optimizing learning. So how well does it incorporate those elements from Dr. G about good learning design in video games? And then what we're adding, it's relatively, I think, unique in terms of these models for video game analysis, is culturally responsive instruction, because I think it's becoming more necessary and more focused on in face-to-face teaching. And in my mind, the video game is in some ways taking the place of a teacher. So I think it's interesting to think about, in what ways is the video game embodying culturally responsive instruction? And this research is building on the work of a lot of scholars. I didn't include our full reference list here, but if anybody wants it, feel free to email me and I will send you a list of all the references, the articles we're using, because it is a lot of good work, and we're basically just trying to synthesize that work and put it into a meaningful model for video game analysis, especially for teachers. So this is a preliminary model. I mean, we're still working through this and refining the questions and sort of how we address these, but we're looking at essentially 3 sort of phases of playing a video game. So a test play of 10 to 15 minutes, where we look at the player experience and the overall game design. And the idea is, as researchers and as video game designers, we could use this to guide our whole process. And we're going to go through all of these phases. But if teachers wanted to use this, if they get done with this test play, 10 to 15 minutes, and these basic things like, is the game fun? Does it work? Like, are there glitches? Is the learning content relevant to the game and the content area? Is it appropriate for my students? If they get through those kinds of questions after 10 minutes, and the answer to most of them is like no or not very well, did they stop there? So they've only spent 10 to 15 minutes trying to figure out if this is a good game. If those answers are good, then they can continue on thinking about these other questions. And for us as researchers, we're going to think about these as we evaluate games, because we want to know, even if it's not a well-designed game from the entertainment perspective, does it still have some good elements of learning design or some good culturally responsive elements that we could suggest for other games, right? So deep play, so continue playing, for an extended period of time and look at basically those areas we talked about from Dr. G. So is the game empowering learners? Is it providing good problem-solving skills? Is it providing good understanding, especially of our content area that we're looking at, right? And all the way throughout, we're trying to think about these questions of whether or not it's culturally responsive. So does it offer chances to collaborate? Does it affirm the player's culture? Does it challenge convention or traditional educational practices? Is it emancipatory? So does it help redefine what constitutes truth? And does it address the whole player? So does it look at things beyond just intellectual, like what I want to learn or what I want students to know? Does it look at the fact that every student is a human who has social, emotional needs, and also emphasize, if possible, like the political aspects of how structures and systems are set up? So this is, again, a preliminary model that we're using, but I think it's going pretty well, and we're continuing to refine it, and we're getting some good results. So what we're going to do next is I'm just going to go back to that Prodigy Math site and play through it a bit, and I'll talk about some comments related to those 6 main areas and some of the specific questions under those. And so what I would invite participants to do during this time is that to take on the identity of a teacher who is an elementary teacher and think about how you might use this game in your math classroom. So maybe take a minute to jot down, player experience, game design, empowered learners, problem solving, understanding, and culturally responsive. And think about a rating you would give based on what we're about to see and do on a scale of 1, which is like poor or not good, to 5, which is excellent, couldn't get any better than this, right? And then also consider all those like before, during, and after things, right? How easy would it be to include this game in your math instruction? All right, so let's go on. So I'm going to just play the game, and I'll sign up for a new account just because I want to see sort of what the whole experience is going to be. I already made an account before, but all right. All right. So it just told me the password 1 is not a good password. You all now know my password, so you can come in and play as me and destroy my credibility as a PhD professor by getting all the answers to first grade math questions wrong. That'll be all right. So, but that's good. So this is how like a student would sign up essentially, right? And then it asks playing at home or in a class. So I would say home. I'm going to say do this later, but basically if you say you're playing at home, you have 30 days to play before a parent or guardian confirms that they know you're playing and they're okay with you playing. So that's a good like educational thing, right? Like this would be good for you to know and to share with parents who might have concerns that they can also access their students' information. All right, so I've got 30 days left to play, so that's fine because we just really need it for today. So now I'm going to start the game. And I'm going to play the math one. And you can already see like
ask your teacher for the class code and type it here.
All right, so you can already see sort of the graphics, right, are pretty decent. It's sort of like I said, like that old school RPG graphics. There's also like some elements just related to the gameplay. So
Ask your teacher for the class
like
code and
I
type
can
it
always
here.
play back the audio if I'm having trouble like reading, you know, because some of these students might be kindergarten students who aren't yet able to, or at least great at reading. All right. So
Choose where you live.
and then again, like culturally affirming, obviously these are sort of countries where they've aligned it with standards, I'm guessing. But I can pick, you know, any of these or other. And if I'm a parent and I want to know why they want this, I can learn more. All right. So again, they went through the curricula of these countries so far and have added them in, and they probably will add more. So that's some culturally responsive elements, right? I'm going to pick United States because that is where I live.
Choose your state.
All right. And then again, like this is going to be, I think, related to the standards because each state has their own standards. All right. So I live in Pennsylvania.
What grade are you in?
All right. Now I can go from grade 1 through grade 8. So that's a pretty wide range. I don't want to embarrass myself by answering a bunch of questions wrong today. So I'm going to pick grade 1 and hopefully I can get those right. And you can also see like that idea of just in time or on demand information. Like I've got this character who's in the game, who's collaborating with me, right? Essentially, this is who's supposed to be talking right now.
What grade are you in?
Right.
What does your wizard look like?
All right. And then, you know, again, like this is a way to this is an example in my mind of some culturally responsive instruction because I can pick and customize my identity, right? So if I pick this character, then I can also customize like this eye color, the skin tone. So I can make a character in the game that looks more or less like me, or I can pick a character that looks nothing like me and think about like, how would this feel if I was, you know, not the white-skinned, blue-eyed wizard? How does it feel if I'm a different skin color, a different eye color, right? So the hairstyles, I mean, not a lot of variety there, but okay, I'll give them credit. They're trying, right? And no gray hair, which is, you know, my actual hair color. So, but still pretty good, right? I can customize and sort of, yeah, personalize my character. And then this is another, so in terms of collaboration, like, does it offer a chance to collaborate? Well, this is assuming like if you're in a class, you could ask everybody else where they're playing, like which world they're playing in, essentially. You can also see which ones have people in them. So, right, we're given some examples of, or some options to the player as a way to collaborate. So I'm going to start with, I don't know, landlion.
Whoa. Hey, listen. Going to be late for your first day of classes at the academy.
All right, so here's the storyline, right? I'm in an academy of some kind, and I'm about to be late for my first day, which is every student's worst nightmare, right?
The name's Newt. I help bring new students to the academy on their first day of class. Who might you be?
All right, now I get to customize my name. It says don't use my real name because you do interact with other people in the game. So then, and it'll give you some suggestions. So you could look through these and see, maybe I want to be Dalton. Or I can just do a random one, but I'll just do Dalton.
Nice to meet you. Let's head over.
All right.
Hey, look, a monster. Monsters can be found everywhere, but they're pretty tame. This one seems a bit grumpy. Looks like it wants to battle.
All right, so there's monsters, but they're not that scary, right? They're pretty tame. They just want to have a good-natured wizard battle.
This is a wizard battle. The goal is to reduce your opponent's hearts to 0 by casting spells.
All right, so
cast a spell, just choose one.
All right, and then this is like an example of just in time to like tutoring or information because it's telling me this is the only one I can click on right now. Right? How many sides? And then again, like there's this option to read out loud.
How many sides does this shape have?
Not a great voice, but okay. And then some explainer text if I'm not sure what they mean. So I'm gonna guess 3. All right.
You cast a spell, your opponent loses hearts. When they have no hearts left, you win.
And again, like this is an example of, we'll turn the volume down just a little bit. This is an example of like just-in-time information, right? And in this case, it's just in time about how to play the game, but it's also an example of going from simple to complex because right now I can only cast the one kind of spell and I'm getting information about what happens when I cast that spell. But as I play through the game, I'll be able to cast more kinds of spells and it won't tell me this every time. It won't tell me when I cast a spell, my opponent loses hearts because I'll know that in the future, right? So let's just do, it's the same question. That usually I don't think happens, but let's see what happens if I answer it wrong. So let's say I would say it had 2 sides. All right, that answer was incorrect. See the answer. That's the correct answer. Back to the battle. All right. All right, so let's try one more question. It's still the same question. I don't think I played it before and I didn't get all the same questions, so not sure why, but unless it's trying to do, I think before I played it 4th grade level, so maybe it's doing something different because I picked 1st grade where it's making sure I really know that one thing before it moves on. Ah, he missed. All right. All right, so how many vertices or corners does this shape have? Think 4, right? And I'm mastering this 1st grade curriculum. All right, so I won that battle. I earned some stars. I gained some hearts. Right, so this is all giving me feedback in the game. And I got some gold. All right.
Whoa, great job.
All right, and so then the game continues, right? So it's sort of guiding me through how to play. And one thing I would say is this is not the worst example I've seen of how to incorporate the content knowledge in, but my one critique so far would be that the content knowledge is still sort of disassociated from the gameplay, right? Like I have to answer these questions in order to cast a spell, but it doesn't have to be math, right? Any question would fit in there. Whereas like if I had to, like press like if it said your button or your wand has 3 buttons. One is a triangle, one is a square, one is a circle. Press the square, and then I had to press the square. Then that would be integrating it a little better. Or if it said press the button that has 4 vertices, right? Then it's still the same content, it's still the same question, but now it's actually required for the game versus just being added into the game. But all that to say, overall, I think this is a pretty good game, a pretty well-designed game for learning. And like I said earlier, they have all those supports for teachers in place. So I think that also helps in thinking about like how would I incorporate this, because this can be like an add-on. And that one teacher testimony on the website says, I went through, I had my students play this as an enrichment activity, and then I went through their reports, and it helped me to figure out which concepts I needed to spend more time in class on, because there were some concepts that everybody was missing, right? So good. I think that's good for playing that. I mean, I might go back after the session and play some more, but for now, I think that's good. So I would invite you in the chat, or however we're doing this. I don't know if we can unmute, but to share how you would rate it based on what we saw so far.
Okay, I can share my interpretation on playing on this gameplay right now. I really like this game. I think this is a wonderful game for students from grade 1 to grade 8. They are awesome. And as you mentioned before, this game cares about their cultural background. Not only the game focusing on the country or state the student is right now, they also focus on the identity the student is. So the student can personalize their identity so that they can feel included, welcomed. So definitely, I think this is a good design. As mentioned in the chat, they're saying this game looks like Zelda or
Right.
Pokemon.
Yep.
You have to catch them all. It just feel like a random, like a popular commercial game. So this is a really well-made game. And so I'll give a lot of positive ratings on all of the aspects. But I have one small question about this game. So since we used grade 1 as an example, are students supposed to learn it before they play the game, or should they play the game and then go to class and learn this?
Yeah, that's a good question. My impression from looking through it is that the game is anticipating the students have had some instruction prior to it. Like I don't think most first graders would know vertices, or even given the definition there, I don't know that would work for them. Although, I guess they would get it, right? Like, you're going to get it eventually. But I think the game is anticipating that it's used as part of an overall instructional plan.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are there any more questions? Oh, are there more feedbacks on this one? So as mentioned in the chat, it says it is culturally responsive in a limited way. For instance, the idea of casting a spell is very Western one. The instant feedback is good, so the player experience would be good.
Right.
Mm. So probably like in the future, like they can also add in more ways to engage in the combat other than the wizard spell. Probably they can find more suitable for each culture, probably, yeah.
So this is an interesting question, whether students might have pre-assessment on their knowledge before entering the game. So I do know from going in as a parent, and I assume the teacher is similar, that you can customize like the gameplay, what the concepts are for the student. So that would imply that, yes, that you could do a pre-assessment. This game, and then there are some games where the game itself will do a pre-assessment before you go in. That the Lost Island game I showed earlier actually does a pre-assessment. Although I think that it mostly uses it to determine in a post-assessment if you've learned anything you didn't know to start versus customizing the content, but it might do both. So in this case, there is the option to customize the gameplay as an administrator, essentially as a parent or a teacher, but I think it would require you to do the pre-assessment. The game itself, from what I've been able to determine so far anyway, does not do it for you. All right. And that segues nicely, I think, into our Q&A time, because I think this is a good time to start to stop the talk and just have a discussion.
Dr. Duval?
You were mute. Can you restate the questions again, Mingjian?
Okay, I can restate the question. So there's a question from Iran saying, what is the learning goal of the questions? For instance, how many sides are there in the shape? Is a question designed for students to learn what a side in geometry?
So yes, in this case, the learning questions or the learning goal from the questions is tied to, in the United States and Pennsylvania, what the state standards say students in that grade should know. So that's one of the topics that's covered in our state standards. So therefore, it's one of the topics in the game. So that's how this game comes up with the questions. And what the goal is basically to help students. So it's based on the kinds of questions students would see on the standardized state tests.
Okay, we have another question. Will there be assessment in games, in educational games?
So the answer is often, usually yes, there's some kind of assessment in the games. So obviously in this Prodigy math game that we were just playing, it's tracking how many questions you answer, how much time it takes you to answer them, and whether you answer right or wrong. And then it will give a report to your teacher, to you, but also to your teacher, to your parent, that says, we covered these topics. We covered first grade geometry, we covered first grade mathematics operations, we covered whatever else they cover in first grade, and your student was, proficient on geometry, but just basic on mathematics operations. So that's where you should work with them to improve. Crystal Island, that game that I showed, has assessments that are both multiple choice and also sort of like explanatory typing, so that they can use to see if you're understanding the underlying concepts about disease causes. So it talks about, diseases caused by bacteria versus diseases caused by viruses versus diseases caused by pathogens, and the different ways that those will manifest themselves. And then it asks you questions in the form of your diary to see if you're understanding those concepts.
All right, thank you. And we have another question in the chat from Iran saying, when it comes to game-based learning, the research discourse center heavily around video games. What about games outside the digital world? Do they share the same advantages like video games when they apply to learning?
Right, so like board games, other kinds of games. And you're right, like at least the research that I spend a lot of time myself reading is on video games, right? But yes, I would say, similarly, board games have similar advantages in that, there are board games that I'm aware of where people will spend hours playing them, right? And the same people might not spend hours learning about a topic I want to teach them about in the classroom. So there is still a benefit there to getting people motivated and engaged. And in fact, when I was an instructional designer, we were trying to redesign one of our trainings for corporate workforce. And it was about our compliance and ethics at the organization, which was important because we were a service organization that worked with individuals with autism. So it was important to have these concepts, but their method had been like a 2-hour PowerPoint that somebody read to you, and was not the most effective way to get people to learn and care about this. So I redesigned it as the classic board game Clue, but for compliance and ethics. And actually, people both came away with a better understanding of the concepts because we did like some quizzes, tests, assessments, I guess you would say, at the end. And people came away with a better understanding of the concepts, but also with a better impression of the training, right? They enjoyed it more. And in my mind, the board game facilitated things that are good instruction, like having people talk with other people. So it sort of encouraged that versus just listening to a lecturer. And also having people think through and come up with examples of what is appropriate behavior. So definitely, I think other kinds of games besides just video games have these benefits.
Awesome. Okay, there's a question from Wei Gao, probably like in response to the Prodigy game. Is the assessment report free for parents or teachers?
So there is, as I mentioned earlier, I think, or I might have skimmed over it, there's a basic report that's free. And then there are more advanced individualized reports that you can get that you have to sign up for, like a subscription.
Okay. And we have a really interesting question from Zihan and Lin Tan saying, for a special educator standpoint, even when the most educational game has voiceover, it is limited to the instructions. For example, when it comes to selecting the states in Prodigy, there is no voiceover for the options. Also, there is a lack of teaching after the students got a question wrong. I have learned that Dr. Duval had experience working with students with autism spectrum disorder. Is it possible to elaborate more on that experience?
Sure. So yeah, those are good points, right? That even as it's attempting to implement some things that make it more inclusive, there's still limitations that they haven't thought through. And I would agree also, that's a good point about like the teaching after something's wrong, right? Like it just says, here's the right answer. There's other ways that you could maybe communicate that. But I mean, it's always interesting because, I always strive in my designs to think about and to be as inclusive as possible, but we're also limited by our own perspectives to a certain extent. So we have to be open to understanding some of these different things. So one example from my time working at the organization where we helped folks with autism was, I went to a conference, a cyber learning conference, and I came back with all these really cool ideas about like cutting edge technology and stuff we could do. And an issue that often students, young people with autism especially, have is that they're prone to being lured away by strangers because they don't process danger in the same way that we might. They don't perceive it. So if somebody, for instance, knows their name and says, "Come with me," they might just go, right? Because that's what they would do. And so the question is like, how do you teach them not to? And one approach that people have, which is kind of weird to me, but is that they will, have like the teacher take the students to a playground somewhere and then have somebody who they know, but who the students don't know, come and try to get them to go with them. And if it works, then they try to train them not to do that. And then they try it again, right? So it just seems risky to me, and it seems a little bit ill-advised. So I came back from this conference and I said, at the conference, they were talking about virtual reality. And so what about like a virtual reality simulation that teaches the students, and then it takes away some of those, inherent risks that one time that you might have them out in public and the person who comes to them might not be the person that and is safe. It might actually be somebody trying to, lure them away or whatever. And they said something to me that made me rethink how I was thinking about video games and whether they really were accessible to everybody, because they said for many of these students, they have sensory issues where they wouldn't even tolerate putting on like the headset or, other things like that. And so I just think, the more experiences we can involve ourselves in, the better we will understand maybe how to design better and more inclusive designs, and building from starting places that hopefully have whatever we know so far that should go in, right? And sometimes I think video games especially don't even do that basic part. Like a lot of video games won't let you a lot of educational video games won't do things like let you customize how your character looks or things like that. But definitely there's more work to be done, and it involves, in my mind, getting a better understanding, like actually working with diverse players to understand how they process and think about the games.
All right. Okay. Thank you for your answer. We have one last question from the crowd. This one is from Yiran Zhao saying, what are the main limitations of game-based learning? Or in other words, what type of learning context is best context to apply game-based learning? In what learning context will game-based learning to be less useful compared to non-game-based learning methods?
Right. I mean, this is tough because my thinking on this has shifted a little bit. When I started my PhD program, I was like, everybody should be doing game-based learning everywhere in every context. And then, as I thought through that and talked to some folks a little bit more and started to understand some different perspectives than my own, I was like, okay, so there are limitations, obviously, to game-based learning. So one limitation can be, especially in a school setting, that you only have a certain amount of time. And so people may focus on the game part and not sort of focus or hone in on the content knowledge part, right? So so that's one disadvantage. And I mean, there's a number of them. Also, not everybody, as surprising as it is to me, not everybody, even kids, likes video games, right? So sometimes we're trying to do this to be a motivator, but some students are not motivated by it and actually, dislike it in some cases, although that's pretty rare. Like I said, most students would prefer that to a teacher talking. So, I think those are some disadvantages. And I think if you look at the kind of games that are created, like video games, an immersive video game, especially like a well-designed, really, like Crystal Island, lends itself to something that's like project-based or inquiry-based. And sometimes that could be harder to think of how to do that well with some other subjects, like, math can be, as we saw, like the math thing is challenging because we're just having basically flashcard questions in the context of gameplay versus having it integrated into the play. So yeah, I think those are some of the disadvantages, and there's many more, but I know we're almost out of time here. So glad to talk about that more on email or, at our meetings, class meetings.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Duval. That was an engaging and meaningful introduction of educational games for our audience. Thank you again for coming, and we hope you have a lovely weekend.
All right. Thank you. You all have a good weekend as well.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
So this is the end of our workshop. We hope you all have a great time exploring the educational games today. However, before you leave, please make sure you do have a screen capture of our summit agenda. We would love to see you all there in our main venue next week. Please complete the form on the top to register for our education summit. And you can also join our WeChat group via the VR code on the right. And for any questions and feedback for our workshop, please use the form on the left bottom one. So we hope you all have a lovely weekend, and we hope to see you all next week.